For more than 3 centuries, the Romanov dynasty ruled Russia. Tsars and empresses reigned, with crowns of gold, palaces of glittering marble, armies that stretched across the steppes in Siberia. Their empire spanned 11 time zones, from frozen Arctic seas to the mountains of Asia. The Romanovs were not just rulers, they were symbols of eternity, of a Russia that seemed unshakable. But power, no matter how great, is never eternal. By the dawn of the 20th century, storm clouds gathered over the empire. Factories swelled with angry workers. Peasants starved on the land, while nobles lived in splendor. Soldiers bled on battlefields, fighting wars the people no longer believed in. And in the heart of it all sat Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, a man torn between the crown he inherited and a world slipping away. Beside him stood his wife, Alexandra, fiercely loyal, deeply religious, but distrusted by many. And around them their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and young Alexei, heir to the throne. To the world they seemed a family of fairy tales. Elegant gowns, glittering jewels, smiling portraits. But inside their palace walls, shadows lingered. Alexei's fragile health, the whispers about Rasputin, and the rising anger of a nation all pressed closer with every passing year. By 1917, the empire was crumbling. Revolution thundered through the streets of Petrograd. Nicholas abdicated the dynasty, collapsed, and the once mighty Romanovs became prisoners. Their fate no longer in their own hands, but in the grip of a revolution determined to erase the old world. This is the story of how the Romanovs fell of exile, betrayal, in a basement in Ekaterinburg, where one of history's most powerful families met their end. A story of myths and mysteries, of vanished bodies and whispers of survival. And above all, a story of how the twilight of an empire ended in silence and gunfire. This is the death of the Romanovs. To understand the fall of the Romanovs, we must return to the beginning of the 20th century, to a Russia teetering between past and future. The empire stretched wider than any other on earth, yet beneath its vast lands, discontent simmered like a fire, waiting for a spark. Nicholas II, crowned in 1894, was not the tyrant some imagined, nor the visionary Russia desperately needed. He was a quiet man, devoted to his wife and children, but uncertain, indecisive, and overwhelmed by the storm of modernity. The throne he inherited demanded iron resolve, yet Nicholas often wavered, believing deeply in his divine right to rule, while failing to see how swiftly the world was changing around him. From the start, his reign was shadowed by tragedy. In 1905, workers marching peacefully to petition their Tsar were met with gunfire outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. Hundreds were killed or wounded. For generations, the Tsar had been seen as the little father protector of the people. But after that day, faith was broken. Trust between ruler and ruled had cracked, and no amount of promises could mend it fully. As if fate mocked him, Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War that same year showed the empire's weakness to the world. Russia was no longer untouchable, no longer invincible. And yet Nicholas remained blind to the urgency of reform, clinging instead to traditions of absolute power. But it was not only politics that would corrode the throne. Within the gilded walls of the royal palace, whispers grew louder about a mysterious man who seemed to hold the Tsarina's trust, Grigory Rasputin, a wandering holy man. Rasputin arrived at court not for riches or titles, but because of a child's suffering. The heir to the throne, Alexei Nikolaevich, had inherited hemophilia, a deadly blood disease. Even the smallest cut could lead to life-threatening bleeding. Doctors could do little, but Rasputin, he seemed able to soothe the boy, to calm the bleeding when others could not. To Alexandra, this was nothing short of divine. She clung to Rasputin, convinced that he was sent by God to protect her son, the future Tsar. But to the nobility, to ministers and generals, Rasputin was a scandal. His rough manners, his rumored indulgences, his power over the Tsarina, it all made him a symbol of corruption. The more Alexandra defended him, the more the public despised her, painting her as a German spy during the First World War and Rasputin's puppet. And then came the war itself. In 1914, when the guns of Europe thundered, Nicholas led Russia into the First World War with confidence. He believed the spirit of patriotism would rally his people. For a brief moment it did, but Russia was unprepared. Its armies lacked weapon supplies, even boots. By 1915, soldiers marched barefoot into battle. They were slaughtered by the thousands. Nicholas made a fateful decision. He took personal command of the Russian army. He believed that by leading them he would inspire victory. Instead, he tied his personal fate to every defeat. Each loss was not only the army's, it was the Tsar's, and with Nicholas at the front, Alexandra was left in Petrograd isolated, relying heavily on Rasputin's advice. Rumors swirled like storms, poisoning the people's faith. By 1916, hunger gnawed at the cities. Factories struck food lines stretched for hours. Soldiers deserted. The people who once saw the Tsar as a father now cursed him as a tyrant. And yet, within the royal family, there was little sense of the danger. In the evenings, the Romanovs played music, wrote in diaries, walked in their gardens, while outside their palace walls the empire cracked apart. Even among the elite, patience broke. In December 1916, a group of nobles lured Rasputin to a palace under the guise of friendship. They poisoned him, shot him, and finally drowned him in an icy river. To them, killing Rasputin was saving Russia from disgrace. But it was already too late. His death changed nothing. The empire still crumbled, and Alexandra only withdrew deeper into grief and prayer. And then, in February 1917, it all collapsed. Strikes spread across Petrograd. Crowds filled the streets shouting, "Bread! Peace down with the Tsar!" Soldiers sent to restore order joined the protests instead. In just days, the government lost control. Nicholas, away at the front, tried to return to his capital, but his train was stopped. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Tsar could not reach his throne. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. He signed his name not for himself only, but also for his young son Alexei. 300 years of Romanov rule ended with a single stroke of a pen. The empire of palaces and crowns became a memory. The royal family was placed under house arrest at the Alexander Palace. Guards watched their every move. Still, Nicholas believed his exile might be temporary. He imagined a quiet life in the countryside, or even in England, where his cousin, King George V, ruled. For a moment it seemed possible. The British government debated offering asylum, but fear of political unrest and revolution at home led them to refuse. Doors closed. So the Romanovs stayed prisoners in their own land. They still dined together, still read aloud, still tried to live as a family. Nicholas chopped firewood. Alexandra prayed. The children played in gardens, guarded, but still smiling in photographs. They did not yet know that the revolution was only beginning, and their story was racing toward a darker fate. When Nicholas II laid down his crown in March 1917, he imagined the storm might pass. Perhaps Russia would settle into a new government, perhaps. His family would be allowed to live, quietly forgotten by history. But the tides of revolution do not forgive kings. From the day he abdicated, the Romanovs' world grew smaller, darker, more fragile. At first, life under house arrest at the Alexander Palace was tolerable. The family still slept in, their own bedrooms still ate together. Around the dining table, guards patrolled the gates, but inside the palace walls they clung to a strange sense of normality. Nicholas wrote in his diary, chopping wood for exercise. Alexandra filled her time with prayer and letters. The girls, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, took turns tending to their sick brother Alexei. To outsiders, the Romanovs seemed calm, even content. But behind the walls, unease grew. Russia's new provisional government struggled to hold power, while radicals plotted further revolution. For the Romanovs, escape routes narrowed. Friends suggested smuggling them abroad to Denmark, perhaps, or even Britain. King George V, Nicholas's cousin, was torn. His heart leaned toward offering sanctuary, but his ministers warned him that bringing the Romanovs to England could ignite unrest. Reluctantly, the door shut. The Tsar and his family were trapped in Russia. By August 1917, as the revolution deepened, the provisional government moved the family east, far from the capital's unrest. Their new home was Tobolsk, a small town in the heart of Siberia. It was exile in the truest sense, vast distances from allies surrounded by cold, forests and unfamiliar faces. Life in Tobolsk was harsher, yet strangely quieter. They lived in the former governor's mansion, guarded but not mistreated. Nicholas was given small duties. Alexandra and the girls taught lessons to Alexei. The children kept diaries describing long walks. In the snow, evenings spent reading aloud and games played in the garden. Under the watchful eyes of armed men, they still clung to hope, believing perhaps that one day they might leave for a safer land. But outside their walls, Russia bled. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power in October 1917. Civil war erupted. The Red Army against the White Army revolutionaries, against monarchists. For the Bolsheviks, the Romanovs were more than prisoners. They were symbols, dangerous symbols. If the white forces captured them, they might rally Russia to restore the monarchy. To Lenin's followers, this risk was unbearable. By spring of 1918, the order came. The Romanovs were to be moved again. Their destination, Ekaterinburg, deep in the Ural Mountains, a city already under firm Bolshevik control. It would be their final stop. The journey was long and bitter. Nicholas, Alexandra and their children traveled by train, guarded by red soldiers. Windows were sealed shut, curtains drawn. At every station, crowds gathered, some jeering, some silent. For many, it was the first time seeing the dethroned Tsar, not as a distant figure in portraits, but as a tired man in plain clothes, a prisoner like any other. When they arrived in Ekaterinburg in late April, the Romanovs were taken to their new prison, the Ipatiev House, soon to be called the House of Special Purpose. It was an ordinary merchant's home, 2 stories, surrounded by high wooden fences hastily built to block prying eyes. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. Inside, it was a cage. The family was crammed into a few upstairs rooms. Guards controlled every movement. Windows were painted over so no one could look in or out. They were no longer royal prisoners, they were captives of the revolution. Meals were plain and rationed. Their jewels, their possessions, even their dignity were stripped away. The guards treated them with hostility. At night, drunk soldiers shouted and sang revolutionary songs beneath their windows. The girls, once admired princesses, were mocked and sometimes insulted. Only their faith and closeness as a family sustained them. They prayed daily, reading scripture aloud, clinging to routine. As the world outside spiraled further into chaos, yet still faint hopes lingered. Rumors reached the Romanovs that the White Army was advancing. If the Whites reached Ekaterinburg, perhaps they would be freed. Perhaps this nightmare would end. But the Bolsheviks knew the same rumors, and they grew more determined to ensure the family would never fall into enemy hands. By June, the atmosphere inside the Ipatiev house turned darker. Guards were replaced with men more loyal to the Bolshevik cause. Orders were stricter. Nicholas and Alexandra sensed the shift, but they never spoke of it openly in front of the children. Instead, Nicholas wrote quietly in his diary, noting the weather, the games they played, the books they read. The entries are haunting in their ordinariness, as if he refused to acknowledge the doom closing in around them. The children, too, tried to live as though life would continue. Anastasia played pranks on the guards, drawing laughter even in the gloom. Maria flirted shyly with one of the sentries, hoping perhaps to see kindness in their eyes. Olga and Tatiana wrote poetry, while Alexei, confined by illness, read stories of knights and heroes. But the walls of the Ipatiev house held secrets darker than they knew. Each day, plans were whispered, decisions made far away in Moscow. The Romanovs were not simply prisoners of circumstance anymore. They were prisoners marked for death. And as the civil war raged, the Red commanders in Ekaterinburg grew impatient. The White Army was drawing closer. The Romanovs' fate could not be left to chance. Soon, the order would be given, an order that would end not just the lives of a family, but the Romanov dynasty itself. The summer of 1918 weighed heavy on Ekaterinburg. Civil war thundered across Russia. The White Army advanced, pushing closer to the city with every week. Inside the Ipatiev house, the Romanovs waited still, clinging to the fragile hope that salvation might arrive. But beyond their painted-over windows, decisions had already been made. Their story was nearly at its end. On July 16th, the day began like many others. The family rose early. Nicholas chopped wood in the courtyard, under watch, his last act of simple labor. Alexandra and the girls read scripture and prayed quietly. Alexei, weakened by illness, remained in bed much of the day. Dinner was plain: black bread, cabbage soup, and a little meat. Outside, guards drank and joked, the sound of boots on the wooden floors echoing through the house. The Romanovs had no idea that every hour brought them closer to death. That evening, the guards were ordered to prepare the basement. Yakov Yurovsky, the Bolshevik commandant of the house, had been given his instructions. The family must be executed at once. There was no trial, no ceremony, only urgency. If the White Army captured Ekaterinburg, the Romanovs could be rescued. Lenin and his comrades in Moscow would not allow such a risk. Close to midnight, Yurovsky woke the family. He told them they were being moved. For their safety, the city was too dangerous. They must be relocated immediately. Still half asleep, Nicholas and Alexandra gathered their children. The girls helped Alexei, pale and fragile, down the narrow stairs. With them came 4 loyal attendants: the family doctor, the maid, the cook, and a valet. They carried pillows, blankets, and even a few small treasures sewn secretly into their clothes, jewelry hidden in hopes of a future escape. They were led into the basement, a narrow room with bare walls and a dusty floor. Nicholas, still believing, the pretense asked for chairs for Alexandra and Alexei. The guards obliged. The rest of the family stood waiting. The room smelled of damp stone and oil from the lanterns. Outside, night pressed heavy on the city. Then Yurovsky entered with his men, pistols and rifles in hand. The family looked at him in confusion. Nicholas rose to speak, but Yurovsky cut him short. "Your relatives have tried to rescue you. You are to be executed." For a moment, silence froze the room. Nicholas's last words were simple, almost stunned. "What? What?" Before he could say more, the guns fired. Bullets cracked and thundered in the close space. Nicholas was struck first, falling instantly. Alexandra followed. The guards fired wildly, the room filling with smoke and chaos. The girls screamed, clinging to each other. Alexei, seated in his chair, was struck but survived the first volley. The jewels hidden in his clothing deflected the bullets. The soldiers reloaded, their ears ringing. The children still lived, wailing, choking on smoke. Some guards hesitated, unnerved by the horror. Others lunged forward with bayonets. The scene turned frantic, gruesome. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia fought, desperately struck again and again, before silence claimed them. Alexei, too, finally succumbed, a boy whose life had been shadowed by illness. Cut short, not by his disease, but by revolution's fury. When the gunfire ended, the room was thick with smoke. The walls were pocked with bullet holes. The floor was slick with blood. 11 lives: the Tsar, the Empress, 5 children, and 4 loyal attendants had been extinguished in less than half an hour. The Romanov dynasty rulers of Russia for over 300 years, ended not with a coronation or abdication, but in a cellar at midnight. But even in death, the family's ordeal was not over. Yurovsky and his men faced a grim task, disposing of the bodies. They wrapped the corpses in sheets, loading them onto a truck under cover of night. The vehicle rumbled into the forest, its wheels sinking in mud. At one point, the truck broke down, forcing the guards to unload and reload the bodies. Drunken laughter mixed with nervous fear as they worked through the darkness. Their destination was a mine shaft known as Ganina Yama. There the guards stripped the bodies of clothing, searching for the jewels hidden within. Some of the princesses had sewn diamonds and pearls into their corsets, desperate to preserve a piece of their heritage. The jewels which had saved them from bullets only hours before were now pried from their lifeless forms. The guards doused the bodies with acid to destroy. Recognition hacked at them to mutilate the remains, then lowered them into the earth. For days, Yurovsky worried the burial site was too obvious. The bodies were moved again, this time to a shallow grave near a place called Borisenkov Log. Some were burned, others buried hastily in pits of lime and earth. The executioners returned to Ekaterinburg in silence. No public announcement was made. The city awoke to rumors, whispers carried on the summer air. The Tsar is dead. The family too. They have been killed. The Bolsheviks confirmed only Nicholas's death at first, keeping the truth about Alexandra and the children hidden. For years, the full story would remain shrouded in secrecy, lies, and half-truths. But in that basement on that summer night, history had shifted forever. The Romanovs, the family once called untouchable, ordained by God to rule, were gone. Russia had severed its ties to its imperial past with bullets and blood. And yet the world did not forget. In the silence that followed, myths began to take root. Could one of the children have survived? Did Anastasia escape? Were the bodies truly found? The answers would take decades to emerge. But for the Romanovs themselves, their story ended there in a cellar lit by lanterns under the guns of their captors in the House of Special Purpose. The night of July 17th, 1918, ended the lives of the Romanovs. But it did not end their story. In fact, in many ways, their deaths were only the beginning of a new chapter 1, written in secrecy and silence, and in the myths that spread across the world. In Ekaterinburg, the Bolsheviks wasted no time rewriting events. Officially, they announced only that Nicholas II, the former Tsar, had been executed. Alexandra, the children and the loyal attendants were not mentioned. Instead, vague statements suggested the rest of the family had been moved to a safe location. It was a deliberate lie. By hiding the truth, the Bolsheviks bought themselves time. Time to conceal the bodies, time to control the narrative, time to keep the world guessing. For decades, Soviet leaders denied the full extent of what had happened. They understood the power of symbols. If the Romanovs were remembered as martyrs, the revolution might lose its grip. So instead, rumors and speculation filled the silence. In the streets of Russia, whispers spread, "The Tsarina is alive." One of the daughters escaped. The boy was smuggled away. And those whispers grew louder when the civil war raged on. The White Army, the monarchist forces, advanced into Ekaterinburg only days after the execution. Had they been faster, the Romanovs might have lived. When they arrived, they found the Ipatiev house empty, the cellar scarred by bullets, but the family gone. Investigators searched desperately for answers. They uncovered traces of blood, scraps of clothing, a few burnt remains. But the bodies themselves were missing, hidden deep in the Ural forests. Without proof, the mystery grew. It was this mystery that gave birth to one of the greatest legends of the 20th century, the survival of Anastasia. In the years after the massacre, countless women across Europe came forward claiming to be the lost Grand Duchess. Some were dismissed quickly as imposters. But one woman's story captivated the world. In 1920, a young woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin. She refused to give her name, spoke with an accent, and bore scars that suggested violence. Soon whispers spread that she was Anastasia Romanov. This woman became known as Anna Anderson. For decades, she insisted that she was the Tsar's daughter. She told vivid stories of life inside the palace, of details only the family would know. Supporters believed her, doubters called her a fraud. Court cases stretched on evidence was debated, and newspapers fed the frenzy. Could one of the Romanovs have survived that night? Could the legend be true? The world wanted to believe. The idea that a child could escape the cellar's gunfire, flee across borders, and live in hiding was irresistible. It turned tragedy into mystery, despair into hope. But behind the fascination lay a deeper truth. Humanity struggles to accept the finality of such brutal endings. Myths offered comfort where history offered only grief. And the myths did not stop with Anastasia. Some claimed Alexei, the boy heir, had been smuggled out. Others insisted Maria had escaped. Books, plays, and films carried these tales to global audiences. In popular imagination, the Romanovs became ghosts, half dead, half alive, their fate uncertain. Meanwhile, in Soviet Russia, the truth was locked away. The Ipatiev house became a secret site, guarded and monitored. No memorials, no plaques, only silence. The regime feared that the Romanovs, even in death, could inspire rebellion. To acknowledge their murders was to admit the brutality of the revolution. But silence could not bury everything. From the late 1920s through the 1930s, foreign journalists and émigrés continued to investigate. Reports emerged of hidden graves near Ekaterinburg. Locals whispered of men digging late at night, of strange bonfires in the woods. The truth existed, but it was buried beneath layers of fear and denial. By the time World War II engulfed Europe, the Romanovs had become more legend than reality. To the Soviets, they were relics of a hated past. To monarchists in exile, they were martyrs. And to ordinary people, they were a tragic story whispered from one generation to the next. The myths endured because they filled a void. In the absence of bodies, in the absence of confession, imagination rushed in. And for 70 years the world debated, were they all killed? Were some spared? Could Anastasia still walk among us? The truth, though hidden, never disappeared. Beneath the soil of the Ural forests, the remains of the Romanovs still rested, waiting, silent, and in time, history would bring them to light again. For 70 years, the fate of the Romanovs remained cloaked in silence. The Soviets had erased them from public memory, reduced them to whispers and forbidden questions. But history has a way of speaking through the ground itself. And in the forests outside Ekaterinburg, the truth waited to be unearthed. It was the late 1970s when rumors began to stir again. A local geologist named Alexander Avdonin and his friend filmmaker Geli Ryabov pieced together forgotten accounts of the execution. Guided by testimony from Yakov, Yurovsky's secret memoirs, they searched the woods of Porosenkov Log, and there, hidden beneath earth and brush, they found bones. Shattered skulls, fragments of clothing, traces of acid. They had uncovered the missing Romanovs. But in the Soviet Union of that era, such discoveries could not be announced. To reveal the truth was dangerous. Avdonin and Ryabov quietly reburied what they found, marking the site in secret. The bones slept again, waiting for a safer time. That time came with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Russia was changing. The Iron Curtain lifted, and once forbidden stories resurfaced. Avdonin finally revealed the hidden grave. Excavations began in 1991. Archaeologists uncovered 9 bodies: Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters, along with 4 loyal servants. The remains bore the scars of violence: shattered bones, bullet holes, signs of burning. But 2 children were missing: Alexei, the heir, and one of the daughters believed to be either Maria or Anastasia. Once again, mystery lingered. Still, science brought answers where rumor once ruled. In the 1990s, DNA testing confirmed beyond doubt that the remains were Romanov. Nicholas's bones were matched to living relatives, including Prince Philip of Britain. Alexandra's lineage was traced to Queen Victoria herself. The truth, after decades of denial, was undeniable. The Tsar and his family had been executed in 1918. The revelation shook Russia. For older generations, it reopened wounds long suppressed. For younger ones, it raised new questions. What did it mean to live in a country where the last Tsar had been murdered in secret? What did it mean that the revolution had begun with such blood? In 1998, on the 80th anniversary of their deaths, the remains of Nicholas Alexandra and 3 daughters were reburied in St. Petersburg in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, the traditional resting place of Russia's Tsars. The ceremony was somber, attended by President Boris Yeltsin, members of the Romanov family in exile, and clergy of the Russian Orthodox Church. For some, it was a moment of reconciliation, a way to honor the dead after so many decades of silence. Yet even then, controversy remained. The Orthodox Church hesitated, questioning the authenticity of the remains. Many believers wanted not just science, but spiritual certainty. The missing children still haunted the story. Where were Alexei and his sister? Had they been buried elsewhere? The legends of survival still clung tightly to the Romanovs' memory. In 2007, nearly 90 years after the executions, the mystery deepened and then resolved. A second grave was discovered near Porosenkov. Log inside were the bones of 2 children. One boy of about 13, one girl of about 19. DNA testing confirmed what the world had waited to hear. These were Alexei and one of his sisters. The Romanov family was whole again. The myths of survival, while romantic, had finally met the cold weight of truth. In 2000, even before the final discoveries, the Russian Orthodox Church had canonized the Romanovs as passion-bearers saints, not for political power, but for the humility and suffering with which they met their deaths. Across Russia, icons of Nicholas Alexandra and their children appeared in churches. Pilgrims traveled to Ekaterinburg, where the Ipatiev house had once stood. On its ruins, a great cathedral was built, the church on the blood, its golden domes shining where bullets had once echoed. Today, the Romanovs occupy a complex place in Russian memory. To some, they are martyrs, holy figures whose innocence redeemed a nation's sins. To others, they remain symbols of a corrupt monarchy, a dynasty whose failures brought revolution. But no one can deny the human tragedy. A family caught in the tides of history, swept to their deaths by forces far larger than themselves. Their story lives on in books, films, and countless retellings. The myth of Anastasia still captures imaginations. Even though science has closed the door, the image of Nicholas, once ridiculed as weak, now stirs sympathy as a father who loved his children but could not save them. And the children themselves, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, remain frozen in time, eternal youths whose lives ended too soon. In Ekaterinburg, pilgrims gather each July, walking the path from the church on the blood to the forest where the bodies were hidden. They carry candles, they sing hymns, they remember. It is a ritual of grief, but also of reconciliation. For in remembering, the Romanovs' Russia remembers its own fractured. Past the glory of empire, the fire of revolution, the price of violence. The Romanovs were once rulers of the largest empire in the world. They died as prisoners in a basement. But in the end, their legacy is not just about crowns and palaces. It is about the fragility of power, the cruelty of politics, and the way history can bury truth, only for it to rise again like bones from the earth. Their dynasty ended in silence, but their story endures. And in that story we find not only the fall of a family, but the enduring questions of human history. How power blinds, how faith sustains, and how even in death memory refuses to fade.